Octavia took the last drag of her cigarette, letting the smoke out softly. She then sat in the direct bathroom, just needing to fix at the moment. She didn't want anyone seeing her smoking, if she could help it, which is why she had holed up the bathroom. Not that she didn't want to be seen anyone exiting out of the train, but it was better to be safe than sorry. With the cigarette finished, she tossed it into the corner where it was instantly blended with the rest of the filthy bathroom. The place reeked with filth and trash as it was, so she didn't feel bad adding on top of it. It seems that no one had cleaned the bathroom in some time, and it wasn't about to change today. The faucet let out a squeaky groan and shuddered at the moment before the fresh water finally came to the tap. She cupped her hooves together and splashed some on her face with the refreshing liquid. She grabbed her sides of the sink, taking a deep breath before looking up at herself in the mirror. You've certainly seen better days, haven't you, old girl? She let out a soft sigh as she began to try and straighten some of her hair with her damp hoof. She knew that she looked like a mess, but she wanted to look like somewhat presentable. And when she saw her sister, after all, she hadn't really exactly had warned Pinky that she was coming. The original plan had to be to write to Pinky on the day that she was going to come and visit. But Octavia never ended up writing that letter. Pinky had no idea she was coming to visit, and Octavia intended to keep that way until she was on her doorstep. Once she was finally satisfied with her hair, she decided that it was time to leave the rancid bathroom behind. The brisk air of Ponyville washed over her for a moment as she stepped outside. She was back at Ponyville train station and was finally arrived after a long trip to Manhattan. The wind rustled in their bangs and she brushed them out of her faces as she looked around. The train station was currently deserted, and not a single pony was waiting to board the train, and she had been the only one to get off. However, she wasn't even the strangest thing that's happening at the moment. The entire town looked like being blanketed in the thick fog, making it impossible to see anything, not without a short walking distance. Even the buildings across the street from the train station could not be seen. A groan of frustration escaped Octavia's lips, realizing that navigating her own town would have to be so much harder now. It had been a long time since she last visited Ponyville, and now she could barely remember the way to Pinky's house as it was. Navigating through the town she couldn't remember was going to be hard enough, but adding the layer of the fog on top of that was going to be nigh impossible. I guess Ponyville doesn't pay its Weber Pegasi enough to deal with this sort of thing. Octavia muttered under her breath as she dropped her saddlebags to the ground. She had packed up a light for the trip, not expecting to see many supplies with Pinky taking care of her. Her saddlebag was a map of Ponyville with a red marker, a pack of cigarettes, a lighter, a picture of her sisters, and a letter she had received shortly before taking this trip. The map was what she needed right now. Unfolding it, Ponyville's layout sprawled out before her, showing her every major location in the small town. Before she had left, she had circled the Sugar Cube corner so she wouldn't get lost on her way to her sister's apartment. Years ago, Octavia and her sisters had moved to Ponyville to get away from the life at the rock farm and all the bad memories it contained. Their parents had been surprisingly understanding, and she suggested the small town was a safe place to move to. They recently saw a married couple known as Mr. and Mrs. Cake, who had welcomed them with open hooves. So when Pinky and Octavia arrived, it was the Cakes that had given them a place to stay, as well as some work on the side for extra bits. Octavia stayed in Ponyville for that first year before moving to Manhattan to start her own life anew. It had been a few months since he had last seen her hyperactive sister, but of course she mentioned that she was still living with the Cakes and that she had upgraded from baker to party pony exactorinaire. Octavia had no idea what such a job entailed, but if Pinky was happy, then it couldn't be anything terrible. With her destination known, she traced her own hoof along the road back to the train station to see the route she needed to take. Oh, that's not so bad. Octavia amused herself with a smile. Just need to find the first house in the fog, and then I'll make a right and follow down the road. Getting to Pinky's would be easier than she thought, even with the fog obscuring her way. With that bit of good news, she folded up the map back up and put it back in her saddlebag. She paused for a moment when she saw that in getting the map out, the letters had been brought along and somehow fallen out. She just stared at it, hesitating to pick it back up. She had already read it so many times, but she was still having difficulties believing it. The letter was the entire reason she made an unannounced trip to Ponyville. If it wasn't a trick or a cool, cruel joke, she needed to come here and find out for certain. She needed the element of surprise in her hooves to find out the truth, so she had gone against writing Pinky that she was coming. Acting as if the letter might bite her, Octavia carefully picked up the envelope and looked at it. In the corner, written in the practiced and beautiful cursive, the words Blinky. Octavia recognized the writing style, even though it had been more than a few years since she'd last seen it. Opening the envelope again, she pulled out the letter, which contained within, for what seemed to be the 100th time she read, the contents. Under the rolling hills of a majestic city lies a quiet little town. A town where dreams can come true and ponies can live a happy, peaceful life. The farm is so quiet, so lonely sometimes. Let's go somewhere, and just to be away for a bit. So I'll be waiting for you there, in that silent town of Ponyville, Bellamina. She read the words again, then again, and then she read it 10 more times before she folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. She couldn't deny the evidence presented towards the letter. It was written perfectly in her sister's hoof writing. Did that mean Bellamina was really writing to her from somewhere in this town? That couldn't be the case. Octavia refused to believe it was true. She couldn't deny, but of course, if it was true, Bellamina was dead. She had been dead for a long time. Shoving the letter back into her bag, she clipped it shut and saddled herself up once more. Pinky should know where the letter came from, and Pinky should know how to deal with this relentless nightmares. As the eldest of the Pie sisters, Octavia hated the idea of her younger sister needing help. Octavia was the one who was supposed to take care of her, not the other way around. But Octavia could swallow her pride long enough to realize that Pinky was an adult, the same as her, and what was most suited for helping her out in the time of her need. And sooner she found her, the sooner this would be over. Crossing the street from the train station, the first buildings of Ponyville first came into view. It was a decrepit of an old building, falling apart in the seams. The windows were boarded up, cracks along the surfaces, and any paint along had since peeled away. Odd, Octavia murmured to herself as the buildings came into view. I know it's been a while, but I don't remember there being any derelict buildings like in Ponyville. It had to have been easier over the decade since she last visited the city, but this building looked like it had been sitting there far longer than that. She certainly would have remembered seeing one in this condition near the train station at least. Pushing the thoughts aside, she circled around the building and started to make her way down the street. It could very well be that building that had just been abandoned the moment she left, and the news stories that Pinky had told her about the new nightmare, Moon and Discord attacking the town. It was possible to leftover of their destruction. A short ways down the road, she noticed that the second building wasn't faring much better. It was too derelict and boarded up, and abandoned. A cold breeze blew, sending a shiver down Octavia's back. She continued her pace, seeing a third building in the same condition. Octavia slowed down a little as her ears twitched and shriveled up in her head. Something didn't feel right. She was certain that the map was accurate, but something felt wrong about the town. There weren't any sounds beyond her hoofsteps and the occasional breeze. Even in the defense fog, she would be able to hear the sounds of the normal city life in the distance. There could be scuffling hooves, the echo of voices of sense of life. She then raised one of her front hooves to the other and gently scuffled, feeling a slight nip of pain. It feels real. Octavia's brow furrowed as she murmured to herself, I've had nightmares that felt real too. A shiver ran down her spine at the thought of being trapped inside of her awful nightmares again. She'd already had one awful dream about Ponyville, but she didn't need a second of hours of each. If it's another dream, I'll just have to get the power through it. If it's not, Octavia stopped to consider what an abandoned, forgotten Ponyville could possibly mean if she wasn't seeing it a dream. She immediately shook that thought out of her head. She had no reason to believe that anything was wrong with Ponyville, other than that it was a strange weather pattern that wasn't being taken care of, and the distant lack of sounds from the ponies around their days of lives, of course. They probably just hold themselves up in their houses until the fog passes. Octavia did her best to convince herself. I'll just make my way to Sugar Cube Corner, and everything will be fine. She continued down her way down the street, following the path of the map that had laid out for her. It was still quite a walk to Sugar Cube Corner, but it was a fairly direct path. She tried her best to ignore the buildings as she was passing, but this was unable. She ignored and boarded up the windows and the doors of each one. It was really as if the town had been abandoned. It was just now the shell of its former self, an actual ghost of the town. There was no way that was possible. If Ponyville had been abandoned, then she would have had to hear about it in the papers, or at least the very letter from her sister. And if it hadn't been abandoned, it wouldn't explain the condition of the buildings they were in. Something was wrong here. Something was very wrong. I've never seen you before. Octavia then jumped out of her skin. A voice suddenly spoke up in the fog. She whirled her face around and saw a tall, pale wall standing between two buildings. She looked up and saw a small filly sitting atop of the wall, looking at her with a curious tilt to her head. Since I've never seen you before, does that mean you're new to the town, right? Octavia's eyes widened as her jaw hung. Sitting on top of the wall was a splitting image of her long-gone sister. Bellamina? Octavia barely above whisper, unable to see what she was seeing. Bellamina? The filly's face furrowed in confusion. Who is Bellamina? Octavia blinked, not comprehending the young girl's words at first. She then quickly shook her head, rubbed her eyes, and looked back up. The filly sitting on top of the wall wasn't exactly Bellamina, but in the fog, she had mistaken her likeness. The filly atop of the wall, with the ashen gray hair and dark gray coat, had emerged with green eyes. Her mane was cut in a small fashion to Bellamina's. As if the lighting was worse, she could pass on the deceased girl's trouble. I'm sorry. For a moment I mistook you for someone else. Octavia shook her head, still clearing up her thoughts. Looking back up at the filly, she put a smile on her face. I'm happy to see another pony, though. This fog is starting to make me feel like I was alone in the town. You are alone in the town, silly, the filly giggled. None of the adults are here to play, just you and me. Octavia frowned. Well, you're out in this fog. That means I'm not alone. She tilted her head. Where's every pony else? The first pony I've seen since I got into town. I don't know. They probably locked themselves up in their houses or something. The adults are boring that way and don't know how to have fun. The filly shrugged, kicking her hooves against the wall, and she sat. I've got the town to myself, and the whole place is my playground. She then stood up from her spot and began walking along its length. That's dangerous, though. What if you get hurt? No one would be able to help you. Octavia walked alongside the filly, making sure she didn't fall off the wall. I'll be fine. I've always been a tough filly, the foal boasted, lifting her head up with a smile. What's your name? Octavia asked curiously. The filly let out a noisy sigh at the question. My name's Doranin Elegi, but everyone calls me Ellie. Ellie glared down at the adult pestering her. What's yours, then? Octavia. The adult then blinked, still registering the filly's name. That's quite an unusual name your parents gave you. Don't mind me. Ellie huffed as she came to a stop, near the end of the wall. She turned to face Octavia, a bright smile suddenly on her face. I just had a great idea. Let's play a game. A game? Octavia shook her head. No, I'm sorry. There's someone in a hurry need to find. With the fog being this bad, I'd rather get there as soon as possible. See? This is why adults are no fun, scoffed the little filly. Come on, let's play hide and seek. I'll hide and you'll seek. It's fun. You'll see. Go ahead and start counting. I'll find a great hiding place. Ellie then leaped from the wall and disappeared from sight. Wait! Octavia tried to call for her, but the filly was long gone. She then stood there at the empty spot where the filly had been standing. Before letting out a sigh, she'll then realize that I'm not coming eventually, I'm sure. Sorry, Ellie. The filly would be all right. Octavia convinced herself of that. The filly seemed to know the town, and she had said to herself that she was tough. Besides, the town was just covered in the thick fog, and it wasn't as if some horrible monster was rampaging through the city. Having to meet the filly did make Octavia feel a bit better about the delusion aesthetic of the town currently seemed to have, though. It was still bizarre, but that all of the buildings she passed were boarded up and run down, but she convinced herself that it was just a bad part of town now. After all, if a little filly could get around fine, then there wasn't anything for her to be afraid of. Her hoofsteps echoed throughout this town. With each step she made progress. She guessed that it had to be at least halfway to Sugar Cube Corner by now, and with much more distance she traveled. At this one pace, it'd be only another few minutes before she was at her sister's front door. That wasn't until her path was suddenly obstructed. A large wall had erected in the middle of the street, patched together with conjured metal sheets, amongst the chain-link fence. Most of the metal looked old and rusted with age. Several sheets of faded newspaper looked like they had been attached to the fenced area well, but were no longer eligible. A word's articulation failed her. Why had a large fence been built in the middle of the road like this? Was there something going on the other side that was being blocked off? Even a wall this large, incredibly unnecessary, a simple roadblock would be sufficed, but on top of that, it was built onto the sides of the buildings, alongside the road with no means of getting through or going around. It was a pony-made dead end for no apparent reason. Well, that's irritating. She clicked her teeth and rode back. Then this put her a big delay on her estimated arrival. Now this time she had to figure her way around the other wall. She then reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the map and marker. Quickly drew a line on the map where the wall had blocked her path. Next she followed the roads, looking for a most direct path to Sugar Cube Corner. Okay, I'll just have to head back and make a couple of rights in the intersections, and I'll be on back, of course. With the new directions she had memorized, she put the map away and started backtracking. Her steps, the nearest intersection, was just a short ways past the wall. Ellie had been so on that she didn't expect to get lost. When the wall came into view, it slowed down to check to see if Ellie had returned, or if she could hear the filly. Silence was all she heard, so she continued on. It seemed that the filly had taken her chance to play hide and seek. Seriously was liking holed up somewhere for now. Or at least she'll be safe or until she gets bored, Octavia convinced herself. The intersection was just up ahead now, and she needed to focus on getting through the empty town. The echo of her hoofsteps were digging under her skin again, reminding her of how alone she was in the empty town. She reminded herself that once she was at Sugar Cube Corner with her sister, she could put all of this weirdness behind her and get on to why she had come here in the first place. The intersection came into sight, but a strange smell hit her nose. The nose crinkled at the smell. Recognizing it, but having a hard time placing it. It was something fresh, but it had been a while since she smelled it. She looked at the ground, and towards the smell, her eyes widened. There was blood on the ground. Fresh blood. It looked as if some pony had been dragged across the road, the direction that she was planning to go. The blood trail stopped after a few feet, as if the bleeding pony had been picked up and at that point been carried away. Suddenly the sound of scraping metal against the ground struck her ears and head began to snap in the direction it was coming from. In the foggy distance, she could see a pony-shaped creature walking away from each hoofstep, scrapping against the wall as it walked. She only saw the figure for a few seconds before it faded into the fog. A few seconds after that, the sounds of scraping vanished. Octavia stepped back in fear. The blood hadn't been where she walked down this road. This had just happened, and whatever pony had walked into the fog was likely the cause, and it was headed in the direction she needed to go. The correct answer was to leave town and never come back when the fog had cleared. Something dangerous was clearly happening here, and she had wandered into the middle of unaware. Once she had this all cleared up, she would have to come back when it's safe. Octavia was about to start running, when an image of a young little filly she had just met moments ago appeared in her mind. What if this blood is hers? If she abandoned her now, then there was no way she'd be able to survive. If some monster had attacked her and dragged her off, there might be a chance to still save her. She couldn't abandon the filly in need. What if that filly had been one of her sisters? Pinky was still in town too, and if she ran now, her sister would be at the mercy of whatever was going on. On top of that, if Bellamina was really somewhere in town, she was in danger as well. She couldn't abandon the filly or her sisters. Octavia swallowed that fear that had built in her throat. The blood was pointing in the direction of the figure that had walked off on. She had to follow it. The first step was the hardest, but once she saw it was moving, she then was following the figure. Her nerves were on the edge, and her body was high alert. She didn't even know what to expect, and as far as she knew, anything could pump out of the woodwork. Another breeze went through the street, and an obnoxious chill blowing against her fur. She wasn't sure, but it felt like the temperature was starting to fall dramatically. It was fall, but the wind was still starting to make it feel like winter. Octavia came on top of the next intersection and stared at the ground. Another streak of blood marked the ground, turning right at the intersection. It was the direction she had planned to go in her mind. As if the figure knew her direction she was heading down, that's where she was going first. The idea made Octavia shudder. It was also impossible that Octavia was being held into some kind of trap, but she had no way to know for sure, and she didn't even know if the filly was actually hurt either. But if there was a chance to save her, she had to try. With another gulp to express her fears, she then turned down the road, and the blood pointed there, made her way down to it. This street was considerably smaller than the one she had been walking down. There was only real enough for room for two ponies to walk by each other, and with the bit of breathing room she had crammed up and claustrophobic in the thick fog, it was an awful street. The smell of blood hit her nose, and she slowed her pace. On the ground was a new trail, one that had turned abruptly into chest-high chain-linked fence. There was a gate that opened slightly ajar, leading into a cramped plaza on the other side of the road. In that plaza she could make out piles of garbage sitting next to the walls, several scraps of discarded rusty metal, and a large pool in the blood in the middle. Octavia paced her hoof again against the gate, it loudly screeching in protest as she pushed it open. She winced at the sound, hoping that it wouldn't draw unaware attention. After a few seconds of silence, she entered the plaza and first examined the large pool of blood in the middle. Much to Octavia's confusion, the way the blood pooled down implied that something had died in that spot and had been dragged into the streets. The blood looked old, and it might have been sitting there for some time. There was only enough left over to stain the ground red. "I don't get it," she murmured to herself. "The trail is leading up to where it's fresh, but so I shouldn't be in this fresh, too." She was then glad it wasn't, but something wasn't really adding up. She then looked from the pile of blood to the trash scattered about. She then looked for a possibility hint or clue as to what happened here, anything that might have happened in that contraction. She then caught her eyes a glimpse of the blue amongst the others black and brown bags of trash that seemed out of place. Walking over to the color, she realized that it was a part of the clasp that was attached to a worn out but torn apart saddlebag. But when she gets close enough, her eyes widened in shock as she recognized the clasp. It was a blue balloon, and the shape of her sister's cutie mark. Her bag now in attention, she fully grabbed it and pulled it close. The saddlebag had several bite marks on it, and the material had been shredded. Several splotches of blood discolored the outside of the bag, as if the pony had belonged to bled on it. Octavia's heart sank in implication. If Pinkie Pie had been the pony attacked in this plaza, was she okay? Was she injured? Was she? Octavia then shook her head, refusing to believe something worse had happened to Pinkie. She had to be all right. Pinkie was one of the defenders of Equestria. She stared at the monster's face and blasted them into oblivion. It was possible that she had been hurt, but there was no way something had taken her life. Just then, a sound sprung to life inside of Pinkie's saddlebag. A sharp hissing, static, ringing sound was imitating within. She blinked in confusion, and she had to expect the bag to be empty. She opened the bag and destroyed saddlebag pulled out whatever was making that noise. "What is this?" she asked, confused. It was a small rectangular device with a dial that with an antennae sticking out of there. There was clearly a speaker port through it, and it was ringing a noisy static. If something was interfering, it was playing a song, but Octavia had never seen a speaker so small before, and in her mind she imagined it to be a miniature phonograph. She then turned the knob, trying to turn the device off, but the noise grew quieter or louder, depending on how she turned the dial, but it refused to shut off. "I'm guessing this thing is broken." Octavia furrowed her brow at it. It must have been destroyed when the saddlebag got torn apart inside. She didn't know what it was, but it had been Pinkie's bag, so she thought that it might have been important. Metal scraped against the ground as the chain-link fence rattled. Octavia jumped in her skin, whirling around the fence of the plaza of the gate. Pressing the gate door was like a pony-white-like figure, not like any pony she had ever seen. White as thin skin, from what she noticed at first. It had no ears on its head, a cloth wrapped around its eyes, and there was a large wound on its head, splitting its head open. A criss-cross of stitches were attempting to keep the wound closed, but couldn't prevent the wound from gaping. Stitches also covered its mouth, sealing it shut, as well as held together an open wound on its chest. Brown bile was dripping from its gaping wound's mouth, and it was from under the cloth around its eyes. Its head twitched constantly, giving it an unnatural shake as it looked straight at her. The figure had been walking closer, and the sound of the metal scraping concrete on the ground as it did. Its hind leg was left wrapped in the slab of rusted metal like a cast. Its mouth opened, letting out a gurgling hiss of moan, the stitches stretching out from the extractor. "Stay back!" Octavia cried, backing up against the wall, as the thing drew closer with each step, causing the metal cast to scrape along the ground. She had no idea what it wanted with her, and she wanted nothing to do with it. The figure came to a stop in the middle of the plaza, just a few short feet away from Octavia. Its head stopped twitching and raised up, its mouth opening wide as a gurgled screech rang out. A spray of brown bile spewed out from the creature's mouth. Octavia just barely dived out of the way, her hooves flailing wildly just to get out of harm's way. Her hooves hit the ground askew, causing them to slip out from under and making her body hit the ground with a hard thud. Her head was ringing from the sudden impact, but she had enough for her senses to roll back onto her hooves. She then looked to where the bile had landed, and her eyes went wide. The trash bags were melting, hissing loudly from the direct contact. Even if the concrete touched was loudly hissing, small stacks of steam rising from the spots. The creature's bile was highly aesthetic. The creature closed its mouth, and its head hung limp for a moment, before it started twitching again. Its hooves began to move, and the scraping sound of the metal returned as the creature once more aimed itself at Octavia. She wasn't going to sit around long enough for it to spew more of its acid at her. She moved Pinky's broken device into her saddlebag and rushed forth in desperation. She slammed her body against the figure, causing it to shriek and stumble in confusion, and in that moment she dashed through the open gate. She raced away at the sound of the ringing device, and her bag finally fell silent. She then ran to the end of the road and slowly to a walk, before stopping and taking several deep breaths. "What in the name of Celestia was that?" Octavia asked herself, turning back in the direction that she had come from. She had no reason to believe that the creature wouldn't come after her, but with that heavy metal cast on its leg, it wouldn't catch up anytime soon. It really wasn't my imagination. Something awful's happened to Ponyville. She sat for a moment as she put her hoof to her head in realization. There were monsters hiding in the fog, strange pony-looking monsters that spewed acid, and that had to be the reason why she hadn't met anyone but the filly. If the citizens had been evacuated, then she'd logically be holed up in their homes. That would have meant that Pinky was fighting the creature as well. As defender of Equestria, this was the sort of thing that she had handled with her friends. But that meant her sister was in danger. Pinky could be seriously hurt or worse, and if Bellamina was really somewhere in this town. Octavia took a deep breath and then gently slapped her hooves against her cheeks. She needed to calm down and focus. It was also possible that Pinky wasn't in danger. Either way, Octavia couldn't leave until she knew or certain what was going on. She needed to help Pinky, Bellamina, or Ellie. There was currently only one way to help anyone. She had to get to Sugar Cube Corner as quickly as possible. The narrow road she emptied out onto the Ponyville's main streets. The following it would lead her to the corner where Sugar Cube Corner sat. She then stuck her head out from the end of the street and looked around. Even though in the thick fog it was futile gesture, and she couldn't see any further than 5 feet. She wasn't going to have at least cross the street. It was her destination was on the corner of that side of the road. If she wanted to find out what really happened to her sister in the town, she was going to have to take the risk of walking out into the open fog. There was no telling if there would be more acid-spitting monsters, or if she had wandered into something more dangerous. And the longer she waited, the more likely that something would happen to her anyway. Octavia darted across the street as quickly as she could, hugging the dilapidated building once she had crossed. Nothing seemed to have noticed her, so she made her way down to town at a brisk pace. As long as she kept her pace up, she'd be able to make it to her destination in no time. That was until her saddlebag began to make that horrendous static ringing noise again. Octavia froze in place, and then turned to stare at her saddlebag, glaring at the noisy device inside. If she was going to avoid those creatures, and in the fog, she would need to be stealthy, and that wasn't going to happen with that thing making such a racket. Even if it was something that belonged to her sister, she was considering it tossing away. The sound of metal scraping the floor once more broke through her thoughts, her head snapping into the road in front of her. Silhouetted in the fog was another pony-shaped figure, the same one that she had seen before. Its head was twitching sporadically, and it was making its way towards her. Octavia took a step back from her heart hammering against her chest as she watched it drawing closer. It had to be drawn by the ringing from her bag. It was the only explanation, right? The road was wide enough for her to avoid the monster, but if the miniature phonograph was drawing in attention from the monsters, it was no more trouble than it was worth. "I'm sorry, Pinky," Octavia muttered quietly. As she pulled the device off, it appeared to be in something was important to her, but as long as it was making that noise, it was only causing trouble, twitching the creature and drawing closer, and could already clearly see it now. With a grunt of effort, she tossed the miniature phonograph at the creature's direction. It whizzed by its head before hitting the ground, and skidding to a stop, the device continued to loudly ring behind the acidic monster. But it didn't even much as twitch the phonograph in direction. "What?" Octavia said in stunned disbelief. The creature was still drawing closer to her. The noise of the phonograph had not even distracted it. Its head lifted up as it loudly gargled, before spewing out its ascetic bile straight at her. Octavia was able to regain her senses, and at the last second, jumping out of the way in time before the vile mixture splashed on the ground where she had been standing. The hissing sound of melted road reminded her of what would happen to her if any of that had touched her. "You, you vile, filthy spitter!" Octavia yelled in anger, rushing forward and slamming against the spitter. It jolted in place, letting out a gurgled groan of confusion, as Octavia took the opportunity to run past it. As she ran, she made sure to swipe up the phonograph that laid on the road, and just put in as much distance between her and the spitter as she could. The moment the spitter disappeared back into the fog, the hissing ring of the phonograph quieted down. Octavia didn't stop running until she was certain that she had put a good distance between her and the spitter. She looked very several painting breathless. She looked behind her, making sure it was really gone. Once she was certain, she looked down at the phonograph in her hoof, nodding on how silent it was now. "You," she muttered, her eyebrows slowly in confusion. "You warned me about the monsters, don't you?" It had sprung to life a few times, and those creatures had come close to her, then immediately went silent once she had gone away from them. That had meant that it wasn't broken at all. It was working as intended. This wasn't something she could throw away. "I'm sorry for doubting you, Pinky," Octavia murmured solemnly. She then tucked the device back in her saddlebag, and even though it was a bigger question in her mind, but it was starting to haunt her even more than as time passed. What had happened to her sister? With that worry in her heart, she raced off down the street, trying to get to Sugar Cube Corner as quickly as possible. The roof was caving in, and the walls were crumbling apart, and the windows were boarded up. It looked like no one had been inside for years, but at Sugar Cube Corner, it looked much as the same as how she remembered it. She hadn't lived there for very long, but it was for no forgetting place that it looked like a giant gingerbread house. This is where Pinky lives, though it does seem like she has been around here recently. Octavia furrowed her brow in worry. If it was possible that Pinky had the gates boarded up the place and holed up inside, though wondered no boards were blocking the door. Stepping up closer to the door as she looked around her, looking for anything that might be moving. With the coast as clear, she raised her hoof and knocked on the door. She then paused for a moment, waiting for an action, only the silence to be returned. She then knocked again and waited, but nothing stirred. No one was coming to answer the door, which meant of two things. No one was home to answer, or no one wanted to risk opening the door. Octavia put her hoof at the doorknob and tried opening it, expecting it to be locked. Surprised then when the door creaked open, free for anyone to enter. "Guess that debunks holding up, Fury," she then murmured as she stepped inside. Inside Sugar Cube Corner was completely dark. The boarded-up windows were only offered a shaft of light at the door, offering most of it. "Hello?" Octavia called out in the direct building, hoping that some pony was around. "Pinky, are you here?" She waited, but no response came. Either Pinky didn't hear it, or no one was there. A shiver of anxiety ran down her spine, realizing that she was still alone. "Well, maybe there's some clues around," Octavia muttered to herself as she reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a lighter and bringing some flame to life. The flame didn't penetrate the darkness far, mostly only illuminated directly near her. She could see a layer of dust that formed on the ground in disuse, but another sign that no one had been down here for a really long time.